It was the last day of school. The high school was filled with an atmosphere of mixed nostalgia and euphoria. Students roamed the halls, laughing, saying their goodbyes, and exchanging hugs. For many, it was the end of an era, a moment they had anticipated yet feared. Among them was Lucas, a friendly, well-liked boy known for his generosity and charisma. He was the kind of student everyone enjoyed being around, always ready to lend a hand. His senior year had been marked by his friendships, his rapport with the teachers, and a certain gleam in his eyes that charmed everyone. But that morning, Lucas didn't show up. As the day went on and his absence became more evident, murmurs among his friends grew. Initially, they thought he might have been delayed or was planning a grand entrance. But as the day neared its end and no one had heard from him, concern turned into a heavy atmosphere of worry. Lucas's mother was inconsolable, calling friends, teachers, and eventually the school. Meanwhile, in the principal's office, the principal, a reserved man named Frank, observed the movement of students and teachers with a serious and impassive gaze. Frank was known for his strict authority, the type of person who commanded respect effortlessly. His presence was imposing, but there was something unsettling about his always introspective stance, a dark mystery that no one could quite understand. That last day, Principal Frank seemed even more distant, watching the students with a look that concealed something beyond educational oversight. When some of Lucas's friends asked about him, Frank maintained a cold stance, as though it wasn't something that genuinely concerned him. His response was simple, almost indifferent. Lucas is probably enjoying the day in his own way. Nothing to worry about. Lucas's friends felt something was off. They knew he'd never miss the last day, especially because he was so close to everyone. He was the type of student who valued every moment with his classmates, and his absence on such an important day was a puzzle piece that didn't fit. Thus, the investigations began. The police were called, and the school became the subject of an investigation, causing an uproar in the community. Principal Frank remained firm and distant, rarely cooperating with the police, which, for many, seemed merely a reflection of his cold and formal nature. But for others, this behavior was suspicious. Teachers, staff, and even students whispered among themselves, recalling moments when Frank had shown peculiar attitudes towards certain students. As the investigation progressed, some facts about the principal's life began to emerge. Frank wasn't a typical person. He came from a family that had always imposed the value of obedience and extreme respect for authority, concepts he had taken to the extreme in his professional life. For him, maintaining order and controlling his environment was more important than anything else. This control, however, went far beyond school rules. Frank harbored a deep, hidden desire for dominance, a need to be absolute within the school environment. And that senior year, Lucas had become a threat to him. The boy's popularity, his friendliness, and his closeness with other teachers bothered Frank. On several occasions, he felt challenged by Lucas's natural leadership. The young man was admired by everyone, and his charisma attracted students and teachers alike. Frank, on the other hand, felt threatened, as if that popularity could strip him of the respect and control he cherished so much. For him, Lucas symbolized insubordination, even though the boy had done nothing wrong. As the weeks passed and Lucas continued to shine in school activities, Frank began to plot something sinister. In the days leading up to the last day of school, he set a trap. An old room, long deactivated and accessible only through the school basement, seemed the perfect place to put his plan into practice. That morning, Frank approached Lucas under the pretense of a private conversation, something that seemed ordinary but carried a sinister intent. As they walked down the corridors toward the basement, Lucas began to feel uneasy. "Why are we going to the basement, sir?" he asked. But the principal only gave a vague excuse about wanting to show him some old materials. Once they arrived, Frank locked the door behind them, and what followed was one of the boy's worst nightmares. Frank, in a frenzy of absolute control, imprisoned Lucas in the dark, cold room, ignoring the boy's cries for help and pleas. At the school, Lucas's disappearance was becoming increasingly troubling. A group of friends decided to search for him on their own, revisiting every classroom and hallway. When they reached the basement, they found the door locked, raising their suspicions even more. One of the students ran to fetch a maintenance worker, and together they managed to force the door open. When they opened the door, the sight was shocking. Lucas was there, tied up and terrified, but alive. Horror and relief mixed on his friends' faces as they saw the scene. The boy was freed and immediately taken to the hospital to treat his injuries and the psychological trauma he had suffered. Meanwhile, the police were called to arrest Frank, who now had nowhere to escape. Trying to justify his actions, he claimed it was his duty to control the students, that he was merely doing what he thought was right. But nothing he said made sense to those who heard him. His excuses revealed more about his disturbed mind than any words of remorse. Frank was convicted and imprisoned, but the trauma he left in the school and Lucas's life would never be erased. The high school, once considered a safe place, was never the same again. The marks of that event became part of its history, a bitter memory circulating through the corridors and classrooms, a reminder that sometimes the real danger can be found where one least expects it. Story 2. It was a gray, chilly afternoon, an unusual setting for the last day of school. The high school hallways were shrouded in an air of excitement mixed with melancholic goodbyes. Students moved from room to room, sharing laughs and memories. There was a nostalgic atmosphere, and everyone seemed to savor each second, trying to stretch out their time with friends and teachers as much as possible. Amid this cheerful hustle and bustle, almost unnoticed, a man with quiet steps and a hard expression roamed the school, observing every student, every teacher, every farewell. This was Gerald, the school's inspector, known for his rigid demeanor and rare smile. Most students barely noticed him, but the teachers and staff knew he was always there, like a silent shadow watching everything. Among the teachers, one person stood out. Claire, a young and dedicated literature teacher, was known for her kind treatment of students and her passion for teaching. She brought a spark to the school, something that captivated everyone around her. But her kindness and warmth seemed to have no effect on Gerald. In fact, Gerald went out of his way to avoid crossing paths with Claire, and the few encounters they had during the year were marked by awkward and tense moments. To Claire, Gerald was merely a silent figure, a distant presence that didn't stand out in the school's busy routine. But to the inspector, Claire represented something far greater and more disturbing. Unknown to anyone, since he had met her, Gerald had harbored an obsessive feeling toward her. In his twisted mind, he'd built a connection with Claire, convincing himself that he was the only one who could protect and care for her, even if she didn't know it. As time passed, Gerald's obsession only grew, hidden behind his cold gaze and distant behavior. He spent hours discreetly watching Claire in the hallways, convincing himself that she belonged to him. Finally, when he found the courage to approach her and confess his feelings, Claire gently declined. She thanked him for his attention, but made it clear that she wasn't interested in any type of relationship. For her, it was a brief, forgettable conversation, but for Gerald, it was a devastating blow. On the last day of school, Gerald was particularly agitated. The laughter, the goodbyes, the hugs, all of it seemed to heighten his resentment. He watched Claire as she bid her students farewell, her face glowing with happiness. At one point, she passed by him and greeted him, but he merely nodded, saying nothing. Claire went on her way, unaware that the inspector was watching her with a disturbingly intense gaze. As the day wore on, the school began to empty out. Students gradually left, and silence filled the hallways. Claire decided to organize some materials and take one last look around her classroom. She was alone, enveloped by the empty and silent environment. She walked down the hallways, absorbed in her thoughts, imagining the next year, new students, and the new stories that would unfold. Suddenly, as she rounded a corner, Claire saw Gerald standing by the door of one of the rooms. He stood there silently, hands in his pockets, staring at her as if he'd been waiting for her. A chill ran down Claire's spine, but she tried to ignore the feeling. She approached him, greeting him again with a polite smile. "Miss Claire," he said, his voice low and calm, but with a tone she'd never heard before. "I'd like to speak with you, here, where we can have a little more privacy." Claire hesitated, but Gerald was already holding the door open, inviting her inside. Not wanting to appear rude, she accepted and stepped into the room. He closed the door behind them, and for a moment, she felt her heart race. Gerald began to speak, but his words seemed loaded with something more, something dark that Claire couldn't quite define. He spoke about how the school would be losing someone special like her, about how unique she was, and how he'd always been watching her. "I know what you feel," he said, and his tone turned sinister, sending a shiver of fear through her. "I know you feel something for me too." Confused and uncomfortable, Claire tried to interrupt the conversation, explaining that he was mistaken, but Gerald looked at her with a disturbing intensity. His hands trembled slightly, and his gaze held a mixture of hate and repressed desire. She realized she was trapped with someone whose mind didn't seem to work the same as everyone else's. "You don't understand," he continued, moving closer. "I was the only one who truly saw you, Claire. No one else saw what you really are. No one understands you like I do." The situation was becoming unbearable. Claire tried to stay calm and asked him to let her leave, but Gerald continued to block the door, moving closer, his face now twisted with hatred. She screamed, and her voice echoed down the empty corridors, but the building was practically deserted, and no one seemed to hear. Then, in a desperate act, he lunged at her, and what followed was a chaos of muffled screams, a clash of desperation and terror. Within minutes, silence fell over the room again. Gerald left, adjusting himself quickly, and walked calmly down the hallways as if nothing had happened. To him, the act was a demonstration of power and control, a way to silence any rejection, to eliminate any obstacle. The next morning, when the first teachers arrived, they found the school in shock. Claire's body was discovered, and the news spread rapidly. There was a sense of disbelief and sadness, and everyone was deeply disturbed by the tragic loss of such a beloved teacher. An investigation began, and Gerald did everything he could to avoid suspicion. He continued to roam the school, performing his duties, but gradually, the police began to notice inconsistencies. Witnesses had seen him near the room where Claire was found, and his presence at the scene and time of the crime was something he couldn't explain. The inspector was finally called in for questioning, and during the interrogation, his mask began to slip. The police pressed him, questioning his relationship with Claire, and Gerald, now nervous, tried to deflect, but his behavior betrayed his true intentions. He contradicted himself several times, and the tension in his voice left no doubt about his guilt. When he tried to flee, he was detained by the officers, his desperate attempts to escape revealing the monster he truly was. Everyone at the school was shocked to learn the truth. The man who represented safety, the always-present inspector, was in fact the perpetrator of a horrific act. Gerald was arrested, and justice was served. The high school was never the same, marked by grief and the memory of Claire, the teacher who always brought joy and knowledge, but whose life was cut short by the sick obsession of someone no one suspected. The story served as a grim reminder to everyone that sometimes real danger could be closer than we imagine, hiding in the shadows, disguised in a face we'd never suspect. Story 3. It was the last day of school, and the mood was one of pure celebration. Students and teachers gathered together, reminiscing about moments from the year, planning for the future, and even shedding a few tears as they said their goodbyes. But amid the crowd of joyful and carefree young people, there was someone who seemed out of place, someone who remained isolated, watching everything from a distance with a dark and attentive gaze. His name was Edward, a new student who had arrived at the beginning of the year and had always been reserved and quiet. Many thought he was simply shy, but there was something about him that intrigued everyone. Edward was the type of student who avoided conversations, preferring to sit in the back of the classroom and never participating in school events. He observed in silence, as if constantly on high alert. Few classmates dared approach him, as his presence exuded something that others couldn't quite put their finger on, a mix of mystery and discomfort. However, as the months went by, some of Edward's behavior began to raise suspicions. He never talked about his family or where he had come from before joining the school. When questioned about his past, he responded evasively and quickly, as if he wanted to end the conversation as soon as possible. His habit of dodging personal questions only fueled rumors among his classmates, who started creating theories about his life. To most, Edward was just an introverted kid, perhaps with a sad or difficult story. But to others, there was something darker about him, a restlessness that no one could quite ignore. Mr. Martin, the history teacher, was the first to notice that Edward harbored something beyond a withdrawn personality. On several occasions, Mr. Martin observed that Edward reacted strangely to certain questions or topics discussed in class. When the subject was laws or criminal cases, for example, his expression changed, showing visible tension. Mr. Martin, with his experience and keen observation, began to suspect that the student was hiding something, though he didn't want to judge without proof. Still, that suspicion grew with each passing day. As the last day of school progressed, Mr. Martin decided to make one last attempt at getting to know Edward better. He called Edward for a private conversation, hoping to understand who this mysterious student truly was. Edward responded with his usual evasive tone, but Mr. Martin pressed further, asking about his family and future plans. Edward avoided eye contact and gave brief answers, as if he wanted the conversation to end as quickly as possible. After the meeting, Mr. Martin was left with an unsettling feeling, as though he was closer to a terrifying truth than he had realized. He decided to investigate on his own, using some personal contacts to learn more about Edward's background. What he found, however, was surprising. There were no records of the student in any of the previous schools he had mentioned. It was as though Edward had come out of nowhere, with no past, no history. This left the teacher both intrigued and disturbed. Meanwhile, the last day of school continued, and as Mr. Martin reflected on his discoveries, Edward seemed more and more anxious. He watched his classmates celebrating and exchanging hugs, but something in his gaze showed he was on high alert. His eyes scanned the surroundings as if expecting something or someone to appear at any moment. Some students even noticed his nervousness and whispered among themselves, commenting on Edward's strange behavior. During the day, the school organized a closing ceremony. All the students and teachers gathered in the gym to watch presentations and farewell speeches. Edward, however, stayed in the back, watching everything with an expression of unease. He glanced around, as if waiting for something terrible to happen. That's when Mr. Martin decided to act. Disturbed by the mystery surrounding Edward and convinced that something was wrong, he called the police, reporting his suspicions and the findings about Edward's lack of school records. Officers arrived discreetly at the school and began observing Edward's behavior, waiting for the right moment to approach him. In the middle of the ceremony, tension began to build. Some students noticed the presence of the police and started whispering, pointing at Edward, who now looked even more agitated. He noticed the movement around him and began to sweat, averting his gaze every few seconds. Mr. Martin, who was watching everything closely, noticed that the young man was visibly shaken, and his suspicions of something serious only deepened. When the ceremony ended, the police officers finally approached Edward, calling him for a conversation. The boy hesitated, trying to avoid contact, but his panicked expression betrayed that something was very wrong. Seeing that the officers were determined to speak with him, Edward tried to act casual, inching away slowly, his eyes scanning the area as if planning an escape route. At that moment, the gymnasium, once filled with joy and farewells, fell into a tense silence. All eyes turned to Edward, who was now in an impossible-to-ignore situation. He started running, pushing classmates aside to make his way, but the officers quickly surrounded him. The young man tried to break free, but the officers held him back, stopping his escape. It was then, under the astonished gaze of everyone, that the truth came to light. Edward wasn't just a new, mysterious student. He was a fugitive, wanted for serious crimes who had assumed a false identity and changed his appearance to escape justice. For months, he had lived among the students, pretending to be just another high schooler, while in reality, he was hiding a dark past he believed he'd left behind. The revelation shocked everyone present. What seemed like an introverted, reserved student turned out to be someone with a terrifying history, hidden behind the facade of an innocent student. Edward, or whatever his real name was taken away by the police, leaving behind a school in shock and disbelief. Mr. Martin watched everything unfold, feeling a mix of relief and disbelief. He knew his suspicions had been correct, But he never imagined Edward's secret would be so dark. The truth about the fugitive student deeply shook the school, leaving a scar that would never fully heal. The high school, once seen as a place of learning and safety, had now become a scene of mystery and fear, a reminder that sometimes danger can be closer than we realize, hidden behind familiar, seemingly innocent faces.